So, welcome to another episode of On Air with Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer. This is podcast number 22 and it's titled Plague, War and Prophecy. The world exists as a theatre for the enactment of a divine drama. Good to be back for another episode, Phoenician Hunter. Welcome.
Hello, it's good to be back. Yeah, we're doing quite a few of these now, aren't we?
We are, and it's always good. And just as a reminder for our listeners, all our podcasts, all 21 of them, including this one when it's being produced, will be listed on our YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/at on air podcasts 2025. And all those words are hyphenated. And they're absolutely free.
I just want to remind listeners that these are just brief chats that we're having about the article, and most of the details and the sources they're all in the article, so you really need to read it to really get the most out of it. So yeah, just wanted to let people know that.
Further to that, the foundation of these podcasts are obviously your research and subsequent Substack articles, which is what we go by.
Exactly.
What we do is we basically have a very broad chat about the topic. And if people want to find out more, including links to the specific articles and authors and researchers, then they can go to your Substack channel, which is phoenicianhunter.substack.com. So let's launch straight into it. The quote that I want to focus on, because I think this forms the foundation of your piece, is by Edwin Johnson. And I know that you've referenced him several times in the past. For our listeners, he's a British historian and biblical scholar who is well known for his critiques on traditional Christian chronology, and someone who is well known for having questioned the authenticity of early Christian documents. And what he argued was that much of the early church's history was fabricated or at least heavily mythologized. So the quote you refer to, and if you just give me a minute or so to read it out, because I think it is important. It goes, the historical principle of the biblical writers is very simple. The world revolves around Judaism. The interest of the present and future is concentrated in the chosen people of the synagogue, and is reflected in the forms of historic retrospection or allegorical contemplation. The world exists as a theatre for the enactment of a divine drama in which the synagogue is always acting or suffering the leading part. What's your take?
Yeah, well, that's quite a profound and loaded statement that is the basis of this article. I wanted to address that statement and the theory that, first of all, the world is a stage, and second of all, that the chosen people or the Jewish people play a leading role on the world stage. And that is evident just as much today as it has been in the past. Just going back to Edwin Johnson, he was probably the only author that I know of that not only questioned, other authors had questioned Christianity, but he actually is the only one I know of that puts it in the Middle Ages. He claims that the works attributed to Christianity were works of the Middle Ages. So we're talking about as late as 400 AD. So that's quite, a claim. So just going back to that statement, he's again one of the few that really understood what the writers of the Bible were trying to set up. And I believe they're just trying to set up the stage for, when it was written, they were trying to set up the stage for future events. And one area that Christians keep mentioning for the authenticity of the Bible is that, a lot of events that we witness are written in the Bible. It must be the work of God because, these events are happening and they're transpiring and they were written 2,000 years ago. So it's the work of God. I address that by saying it's not the work of God. It's the work of writers. It's like a script. So they write this stuff down and then they fulfill it themselves, because they fulfill it by manipulating or orchestrating certain events to make it appear like it's the work that has been written by, the authors of the Bible thousands of years ago. That's the way I address it. I mean, I'm just using logic here.
Of course.
Okay. So now going back to that quote, for example, when he says that, it's the suffering of the chosen people, for example, this we can see throughout history with the stories attributed to the Jews with the destruction of Jerusalem and the Solomon's Temple. And then that results in the diaspora where, the Jewish people are sort of homeless for a long period of time. They become slaves to the Babylonians. And then we have the Crusades where, they're victims of that. They're victims of the Inquisition, the expulsions from around the world, living in poor conditions, apparently, in ghettos, to more recent events like the Holocaust. They keep playing throughout history, they keep playing this role as the victims, right? Now, what's important to understand is that these events don't have to be true. They can be symbolic. It's important that you believe they happened, not that they actually happened, okay, for prophecy to be fulfilled. Okay, that's the way it works. And I'll give you an example how this works. For example, 9/11, or let's say 0911, okay, which is, the month and the days and the day and the month, is associated with the collapse of the Twin Towers in New York, which a lot of people attribute to Jews. For example, there's the claim of the dancing Israelis, and how Jews were told not to go into work that day. There's stories around perhaps a Jewish involvement.
And the owner of the Twin Towers bought insurance a week before or a month before claim.
Oh, yeah, and he was Jewish too, right?
That's right.
Yeah. There's this Jewish sort of involvement in that event. Okay. So if we reverse that number, 9/11, so 0911, we get the year 1190. So 1190. In 1190, there was a burning of a tower in York City, England, where Jews had locked themselves in this tower and were killed. So this is some kind of synchronicity between the dates, the events, the victims. This is the way it works. So, they set up these events to mirror past events, or we're not certain if that actually happened, but that's not important. What's important is that we believe that these events are connected, and they're connected to dates. And again, they're connected to events written in the Bible. This is what I'm trying to show. So, going back to what Johnson says, the world exists as a theatre for the enactment of a divine drama. And this divine drama is the Bible, or the New Testament. So now the priest class created the stage, okay? And we've discussed this in previous articles where I believe the merchant class created the modern world. So they've created the stage. What they do is they give us the actors, and they wrote the script. It all belongs to them. What they're doing is fulfilling their own script with their own actors and the stage that they've created. This is where people argue that the Bible must be true, because everything that has and is currently transpiring in the world is written in this book. So my response to this is quite simple. If I want people to believe my story, and I have the power to orchestrate or influence certain events to fulfill the script, that's exactly what I'll do. And that's what this merchant priest class do, because they've got the power to influence certain events. And, COVID was one of these events, and we'll get into that a bit later. But, that just shows, COVID just showed how much power they've got around the world. Every country
was complicit. Yeah.
So people with little to no critical thinking skills will say, wow, it's happening just like the book said. It must be written by God. Oh, my God. Yeah, wow. To me, that's just blind faith and preschool logic.
Of course.
Okay, it's not God's ultimate plan, but rather those of the persons actively manipulating past and current events, all right, to present the illusion of divine influence. That's what gives them power. You believing in it gives them the power. All right, so proof of God's influence on human affairs is irrelevant. What is important that you believe that God has this influence, right? This is the secret of magic. This is the magician's secret doctrine, okay?
Yeah. That's absolutely fascinating. And I've got to say at the onset that I couldn't agree with you more, 100%. I've always been vocal about the world being a stage. You've heard various political leaders talk about, central casting. That's been bandied around a lot. So for me, that's purely a design to keep humanity under a spell and frequency of fear. So absolutely, I thought that was a very great explanation. Well, you also raised the importance in your article of astronomy and astrology, which we've discussed at length in previous podcasts. In your piece, you suggest that the first astronomers were priests and that they understood, celestial objects and events to be manifestations of the divine. And there is a quote there, which I'll encourage readers to go and read it. What's your take on that?
Yeah, good, because this plays an important role. So this priest class write the scripts, and the way they're able to manipulate certain events is through cycles. Okay, and we've discussed, as you mentioned in a previous post called Time is Money. And I showed how the study of cycles gave the ancient priests the knowledge of when to orchestrate or manipulate events. All right. So they have to be done at a certain time. They understood that cycles also affected the thoughts and feelings of people.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
for example, yeah, right. And an event at a certain time could have a positive or negative effect,
Mm,
therefore influencing how people react to it. So
of
it's
course.
it's either enhanced at that particular time, and then when I read this stuff, I think of COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a perfect example. And I'll show later that I believe that was orchestrated at a very particular moment in time for the full effect that they wanted to achieve. I mean, this is how magic works. And this brings me to another point. Magic is just science not understood.
Yep,
Okay?
yep.
So what I found in researching this article is that recent astronomical events, right, suggest that it may be time for the fulfillment of this Jewish prophecy as recorded, in their scriptures.
Which brings me on to my next point about the importance of the Saturn Jupiter conjunction. And again, for the benefit of our audience, and I'll be as brief and as self explanatory as possible. But the Saturn Jupiter conjunction is like, the Super Bowl of astrology. Let's put it that way, right? They're two giant planets that meet up every 20 years, but when they get really close, like as you've said they did in 2020 with COVID, it's sort of next level stuff, right? So they basically, from a
Yeah.
scientific perspective, they photobomb each other in the sky, and it looks like one big crazy star, one bright crazy star. So I've been told that astrologers around the world go nuts over this because it's supposed to mark a big era defining shift, like when the vibe of the whole world starts changing. So, whether somebody's into astrology or not, just think of it like a cool space stuff. It's kind of wild to think that these planets might actually be low key shaping history. So again, this is a great segue into that part of your article.
Yeah, you mentioned that, people might not be interested in astrology, but the important thing is that they are very into it. They place a lot of value in this stuff for good reason because they
Yeah,
understand how it works,
that's
okay?
right. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right in saying this is a big moment in astrology, when those two planets get that close. And also what is important is during COVID they were visible to the naked eye. So
Mm.
that's how, significant it was. Now, so this article all began when I started looking into COVID and why such a massive worldwide event was happening at this particular time. So that's what I was looking at. I was
Mm.
saying, why now? Why was that happening? And that's when I looked into knowing what I do about astrology and that, the priests and the merchants always, focus on it. That's where I wanted to look to get my answers. So
Mhm.
what I found was on the night of December the 21st, 2020, right? So during the epidemic of COVID-19, right at the height of it, right? Jupiter and Saturn met, as you said, in a great conjunction. Now, what's important is this is the closest they could be seen in the sky together for nearly 800 years. Okay, so it doesn't happen often. And the last time Jupiter and Saturn appeared so close was in 1623, so 400 years ago. But there's a slight difference. The last great conjunction which was as visible as it was in 2020, occurred in 1226.
Mm.
Okay, so next year marks exactly 800 years.
Oh,
Okay,
wow. Yep.
yeah, perhaps something's going to happen next year. This is important as well because,
They have been,
well,
again, without becoming conspiratorial,
yeah.
places like the WEF and WHO have been talking about how we can prepare for the next pandemic. Now, time will tell.
Yeah, no, I'm of the belief something important is going to happen next year as
Mhm.
well. Also, I think I mentioned it in another podcast or article about 2026 being significant for the merchants in terms of their cycles, their panic and boom economic cycles anyway. So,
Right.
yeah,
Okay.
something's going to happen.
Okay.
Yeah, going back to the article, the celestial conjunctions, all right, or comets for example, right, were often seen as signs of terrible things to come, right, by ancient astrologers and astronomers, and and they attributed seeing these things to come in war or plague or famine,
Mm.
and I think it's been said that just before the Black Plague, they were seeing a lot of comets in the air or celestial, events and things like that are recorded. What I found was that Jewish scholars also believed that the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction was very important and influenced the fate of nations, cities, and religions. So that's important to note. And that past Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions had also influenced the births of prophets and leaders, including those of Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. That covers all those three Abrahamic religions.
Okay. Okay. I mean, geez, 20, you're saying 2020 happened right after that conjunction, is it pure
Yeah.
coincidence? It's kind of crazy, isn't it? I would be interested to dig deeper into maybe the Spanish flu in 1918 and whether that was actually orchestrated. But again, that's for another discussion.
I think that has to, I think going back, no, going back to that, I think that has to do with, my brief look into it. I think it
Yeah.
has to do with vaccines when they started.
That's an interesting topic to maybe dive into and see whether there's any connection. But obviously, astrology and astronomy versus, what the powers that be or the elites want to do. And maybe you're right. 1918 was so long ago that maybe it was just for the introduction of vaccines. Nevertheless, let's move on. I'd like to talk more about Edwin Johnson's writings, if I may. Can you tell us a little bit about his claim that the earliest Jewish writings date to as recent as 1200 AD?
Well, yeah, that's according to Johnson's research, the foundation of the whole synagogue system. So, all Jewish writings dates from the period between 1000 and 1200 AD. Okay, placing them. So, if you remember that date, 1200,
Yeah,
it places these close to the last visible great conjunction of 1226.
yeah.
Okay, so the beginning is 1226, and then 800 years later, I'm suggesting after this great conjunction, are we going to see the fulfillment of those prophecies? I also present evidence in the article, and again, we'll just touch on it very briefly here,
Mm.
that I present evidence from another researcher who was an expert in chronology, that he also could not find any traces of an ancient Jewish era before the 11th century or 1000 AD. So he, again, this other researcher, his dates match Johnson's as well. Okay.
Okay, okay.
So recall that these priests have had knowledge of celestial cycles since the beginning of civilization. So astrology goes all the way back to, the Chaldeans, Babylonians, pretty
Yeah,
much Mesopotamia, where, the dawn of civilization, or what researchers or historians call the dawn of civilization.
right.
It's also something that is known in many cultures and civilizations around the world, which had no connection to each other as well.
Mm.
Or we're told had no connection. So, it's an ancient science, and I actually think it's been purposely sort of obscured and sort of made to seem like a pseudoscience and poo-pooed
Mhm.
for the reasons that they reveal so much. Where people understand them, it can
Yeah.
be a very powerful tool. They don't want us to know that, so that's why. So yeah, the ancients would have had knowledge of these events, astronomical events, and most likely formed their ancient writings around these cycles. Okay, that's what they've done.
Okay, so I guess it's what you're saying. It's part of a bigger belief that celestial cycles and human choices, let's call it that, are linked. Kind of like how I guess some people today still look to astrology for patterns in history, like you've just described.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Okay, so if I've interpreted this correctly based on your article, in your article you mention another Jewish researcher called Ezra, and he gives a warning to the Jewish people essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here. But there's this old astrological idea that when the Jewish communities turned away from the Torah observance, the zodiac, especially Aquarius, that could influence their fate. For example, if Saturn and Jupiter conjoined in Aquarius under some pretty harsh alignments, it supposedly brought hardship to Israel. That's what he was telling them. So whether you buy into that or not, it's kind of wild how ancient traditions tied cosmic events to real world consequences. That's my take, right? So I guess it's part of a bigger belief that celestial cycles and let's call it human choices are linked, kind of like how some people
They
today,
are.
yeah, it's kind of like how some people today still look to astrology for patterns in history.
Yeah, and patterns to their own life, events in their own life.
That's right.
So yeah, of course they're linked. And like I said, we've gone through this in other podcasts. They know this science, and they've mastered this science, and this is why they're able to manipulate the events and our reactions and feelings towards them.
Yeah, yeah,
And Jewish scholars were no different. They understood this, and that Ezra guide gave a warning to the Jewish people, like you mentioned, that during this conjunction, if it happened during the age of Aquarius, which is important because I believe, right,
mm,
that we are already in the age of Aquarius.
mm,
And so to me, this conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter happened at this time in the age of Aquarius and is right on schedule to fulfill what Ezra was warning about, that Israel was going to be in peril or was hardship.
yeah,
Um, so this is interesting because I don't believe that Israel is the home of the Jewish people. Okay, I think
right.
that whole thing is made up, and this gives you the reason why it was made up.
Mm,
Okay, because they understood that if they needed to place, they set in the stage. Remember, they set in the stage, so they need to have the stage set up that there's an the Jewish people in Israel, which is in that part of the world at this particular time in Aquarius, at the time of the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. You see, this
yeah,
is what they do. They set
yeah.
it up. It's not God's plan. God didn't do this. They're setting it up. They're the puppet masters. They own the stage. Right? They're playing with the toys,
Yeah.
with the actors and the sets, you see.
And the masses are
Yeah.
oblivious to this.
They do this in cartoons and old films when they're
Of
doing the
course,
gods
of
of
course.
Olympus, and they're looking at this map of the world, and they've got these like these models of things, and they shift them on the stage on this do you remember that? Do you
Yeah,
ever,
I do
it's the
actually.
same thing.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
so they've set up Israel this time, this construct, okay,
yeah.
for a better term. Yeah,
Crazy.
so yeah, it is, isn't it? It's nuts. So Ezra believed that it was possible to link the conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter to also the arrival of the Messiah, which is important as well.
Of
Okay,
course,
so
yeah.
it's all happening now. If people see, we all
Mm,
seen this happening
yep,
before us,
yep.
but like I said, the less intelligent people are saying, "Oh, it's the work of God."
Of
See,
course it is, yeah, yeah.
so just briefly, the Messiah in Judaism is a savior, a figure, and the future Jewish king from the line of David. Just made up stuff anyway. Who is expected to save to save the Jewish nation, right, and bring
Yeah.
peace and rule the world during this Messianic age. Sorry, I sound like a wanker, but it sounds like wank to me when I read this stuff.
Oh,
By the
100%.
way, the person who brought peace on earth was also known as Caesar Augustus as well.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so this title of the peacemaker to bring peace on the world, it's not only attributed to the Jewish Messiah, and it's attributed to Jesus Christ. It's been attributed to other people in the past as well, and Caesar Augustus was another one. Okay, so and Jews and Christians, listening to this now are going to are getting really excited because they believe that this is actually going to happen.
No, no.
And yeah, it is going to happen, but it's
It's
not it's not
so
God. It,
it's so frustrating.
it is very frustrating. Don't worry, people, Christians, when the time comes, you will be presented with your savior figure. I'm certain. Don't worry. So they give you the bread and circuses, so you won't revolt.
Oh,
Basically,
bread and circuses.
that's what's happening.
The classic panem et circenses, which is obviously in Latin, and it's basically, again, I love this. It's the idea that governments can keep people happy, but most importantly, distracted by giving them cheap food and entertainment so they don't ask too many questions about real problems, which is why, you see global sporting events. That's bread and circuses, right? So think of it like
Yeah, and
ancient Rome's version of just shut up and watch the game while we handle the sketchy stuff behind the scenes. You know, again, this is what most frustrating to me is that the masses are pretty much blind to all this, and once you offer them a different perspective because it goes against their beliefs or for whatever reason, they start to fight back. It's like when you're trying to break the matrix and the Agent Smiths come and just absolutely hammer you because of your view. Nevertheless,
yeah,
um,
and you say that the arena, it's a theater. The gladiators are playing a role, and it's the same with television and Hollywood.
mm, mm,
In the stage, the politicians, and it's all theater. I mean,
yeah,
when we look at Donald Trump,
yeah,
do you know he's considered an actor? He's
yeah,
vice
yeah.
president.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
if you
he's an
go,
actor.
yeah, of course. But if you go onto IMDb, which is the world known
Yeah, that's right.
platform, most politicians, and I'm talking about American politicians, are there as actors or producers. And this is when I mentioned earlier,
Yeah,
I referred to central casting. This is what it is. This is the
exactly.
world is a
Yeah, and
stage.
Ukrainian
Mm,
President
yeah,
Zelensky is
yeah.
also an actor.
Yeah, he
So,
was an entertainer
oh,
before they made him a president. He was an entertainer. If you look at some of the footage from the 90s, he's dressed in knee-high leather boots and literally short
drag.
shorts
Yeah,
and drag. He's an entertainer, and this is what politics today is. It's all, as they say, the world is a stage.
exactly. By them revealing that they're actors, they're almost trying to tell you. You know,
Well,
that's the
again,
way I see it.
so they don't experience karmic retribution. This goes back to, associations like the Freemasons, etc. They need to tell you what they're going to do so they don't experience karmic retribution. That's part of their plan. That's part of their belief system. So, nevertheless, earlier you referenced the other great conjunction, which was 400 years ago in 1623. What can you tell us about that?
We are told that although this was also a great conjunction, it appeared closer to the sun, and therefore it was more difficult to see. So it wasn't visible to the naked eye,
Mm,
right? Well, it was, but it wasn't very clear, right? This also has an effect. So this date corresponds closely with the arrival of the so-called long-awaited Jewish Messiah of Sabbatai Zevi, which everyone or most people have heard about, who was born, right, only 3 years later in 1626. So very close to that conjunction.
mm,
Now, Sabbatai Zevi was proclaimed to be the Jewish Messiah in 1666. He gained a large following amongst the Jewish community, and although many of the older, wiser rabbis did not go along with his philosophy and his teachings, so there was a bit of controversy there. He later converted to Islam, apparently under forced conversion, and then that's when most of his followers denounced his claim as the true Jewish Messiah. Because it wasn't a true conjunction, it reflects on what's happening here on earth. So that wasn't it wasn't the true Messiah then,
mm.
right? But he's still a very influential person, and a lot is written about him, and many people suggest that this is around the time that sort of Judaism is sort of split and creating various branches, and similar to we discussed in the previous podcast with the Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation. When the Catholic Church is split, then we get all these other variants coming through later.
Okay.
Um,
So why do you believe the 2020 Great Conjunction is the real one that's going to fulfill Jewish prophecy?
According to the Talmud, and other Jewish writings, the deadline by which the Jewish Messiah must appear is 6,000 years from creation. So this is approximately the year 2240, or, the next 100 or 200 years.
Mm.
So considering that the next great conjunction may be 400 to 800 years away, this 2020 event seems to be the last opportunity before the deadline, right, to usher in the Messiah. So they can't risk, waiting another 400 or 800 years if their deadline, falls before that date.
Of course.
So, yeah. So, observing recent and current world events, what I see is the plague has come, in the form of COVID. Israel is currently at war, which they plan on, extending into Israel and beyond. And, this event has,
Into Syria and beyond, you mean?
yeah, into Syria and beyond.
Yep.
And this action has attracted, a lot of criticism from around the world, towards, the Jewish people in
Mm,
Israel.
mm.
And it almost seems like, they're in need of a savior figure to come
Yeah.
along and how,
Yeah.
help them along. So, I'm also keeping a close eye on the political events around, they're always talking about the building of the third temple,
Mm.
which needs to be constructed before the Messiah comes. All these
Yeah.
little, fairy tale scripture, little things that they put in place for their story to unfold. What we need to understand is that when they talk about the third temple and these events, they don't always need to be a physical thing and a physical appearance. All right. So the way I look at a lot of this stuff, it's symbolic or an allegory. Right. So remember that the temple is the mind.
Yes.
Right. I believe that AI, artificial intelligence, is a metaphor for the building of this temple, the
Okay.
mind.
Okay.
So what's AI doing? What's its purpose? It seems to be taking the role of people's critical thinking skills almost.
Mm.
It's this artificial mind that people tap into to, get answers to things, right? It's almost replacing your thoughts,
Yes.
right? Or maybe building a new kind of way of thinking as well, a future way of thinking. It's interesting that also the AI comes around at this time as well, just after this conjunction. They do these things on purpose. They all come at the right time. So now, Israel and Jews aren't alone in this play, because at the very top, Christianity and Islam and Freemasonry are also involved. And a
Mm.
lot of people point to Freemasonic shenanigans and symbols and how people see certain signs through the media and actors doing certain signs. And so I consider Freemasonry part of this same system as Christianity, Islam, and Judaism.
Mm.
It's all the same system, and I've written about this before, and we've spoken about it before. So obviously, all those three have a role to play. They've all got their role to
Mm.
play in this story that's going to unfold, this prophecy. All the signs are there.
Well, look, there's a lot to take in and to decipher, and I think this is a discussion that needs to be had. And I think, as I said earlier, the masses are pretty much asleep at the wheel when it comes to diving deep
Yeah,
into why events occur, 9/11, COVID, etc. And there are probably several more.
that's right. And these are the people who are going to go to AI for their answers. The
That's right, but
temple.
yeah, but again, and what does AI do? It literally collates everything that's been put online and gives it, its best output. Nevertheless, we've reached obviously the end of what I would say is probably one of the most fascinating chats that we've had, and I think very topical. What are your closing comments so we can now close the loop and start the discourse happening?
We may be witnessing the closing acts of this, what I call Abrahamic series, and perhaps, a new dogma will emerge from this. Also, in both Jewish and Christian writings, I found that it was often believed that the Great Conjunction was the moment of the emergence of a new religion. I've been on record saying that a new age, which I believe we're in, requires a new operating system. All right, and this new age and this new operating system includes language, government, a new form of commerce, and of course, a new religion. You don't need to collapse a religion to replace it. Okay. So people don't freak out. Your religion isn't going anywhere, it's changing. Now, this can be done over a long period of time, slowly morphing and changing into something else. So, many Christians today say that their faith does not represent them any longer. It's quite different today to, the original. The church today is very different from the original church.
Sure.
Here, a lot of Catholics say this about, Vatican II or whatever. It's changed. So this is all done on purpose, all right? They're moving. Religion is alive and needs to keep changing and moving. Now, I believe Christianity actually came about in similar fashion, right? The old state religion of Rome was probably based on Caesar worship to a large extent, right? And then they borrowed from other Eastern religions and doctrines, and then it slowly altered over a long period of time, and then it came down to us as Christianity as we know it. And don't forget that the world, going back to Johnson's earlier quote, that the world exists as a theatre for the enactment of a divine drama. This is where paid influencers have a role. Paid influencers, and I'll just mention a few where Jordan Peterson, and Russell Brand, who I cannot stand those two, but for some reason or another, recently they've been pushing this whole Christian thing. Have you seen him been playing this role?
Yeah, I have, and I've seen Russell Brand spruik about his
Spruik, yeah.
That's what they're doing about his baptism and his now new founding Christianity, or his belief in Jesus Christ.
Why can't he keep it personal? Like if I go to church, or if I was going to change my faith, it's between me, God, probably my family. That's it. You don't need to announce it this is why they're influencers. They're paid to do this. It's not authentic. It's not genuine. They're playing this role. They're playing a role at a particular time. Okay. It's important people understand that.
Well, again, fascinating work, Phoenician Hunter. I really love how deep you dive into that rabbit hole, and if this, at the very least, can cause people to start questioning the system, and we hear a lot about the world as a stage. Well, this is a true definition of why the world is a stage.
Yeah, and also no bigger or important script than the Bible, is there?
That's exactly right.
And that's why they call it scripture, people. They're telling you scripture, it's in the words.
It's in plain sight. Again, this is where we need to try and help people awaken from their slumber.
Yeah.
So look, here's my takeaway, right? Whether you see history as divine drama or elite orchestration, as you've clearly described here, patterns don't lie. Plagues, wars, celestial signs, I see them as all being part of the same script, recycled across ages to keep us locked in a cycle of belief and control, right?
Exactly. Perfect. Yep.
So the question, as again you've clearly stated, isn't so much about is this prophecy, but rather who's writing it, right? Yeah. So it's, I encourage listeners to access your articles on Substack, where there's a magnificent selection of them that fall under the free subscription, and your channel is at phoenicianhunter.substack.com. I want to thank you for your insights, Phoenician Hunter.
Thank you. Thank you for your time again.
It's been, again, a great chat. And remember to our listeners to subscribe to both Phoenician Hunter's Substack and our YouTube channel, which is at On Air Podcast 2025, all hyphenated, and listen to our last 21 podcasts. And remember that our YouTube podcasts are absolutely free. So it's a great deal there. So stay awake, question the narrative, and above all, remember, the real end times might just be the end of their time. So until next episode, keep digging. This is Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer signing off.